Cool. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. Just to give you guys some context, my name's Mark. I've been building kind of like dApps and different incentive mechanisms for communities in Ethereum for like 5 years now. So have seen a lot of the kind of different ways different community models have gone very well, and the way that some of them haven't worked. And I'm very excited to be sharing kind of this new approach we have towards building tokenized communities, in particular with a focus on kind of like digital communities, social clubs, these sorts of entities, these types of DAOs, and trying to like figure out this problem of fixed supply. So I will posit, and I think some of you in the room might recognize this, that we have this fixed supply problem. It started way back in 2008 with Satoshi inventing Bitcoin, and of course it's very magical now that we have these blockchains that can ensure scarcity across the world with no nation state or centralized actors. I think it's awesome. And of course, it's been wonderful for the charts. Speculative assets, which are fixed supply, typically do much better than dilutive assets. And so a lot of tokens which have launched since Bitcoin have also followed suit and have seen some of that appreciation as well, because ultimately fixed supply being non-dilutive helps with your pumponomics. But there's a sort of another half of this, which is less frequently discussed, especially in the context of Bitcoin, which is around kind of inflation over time, or studying the network across time. How do these things actually work? And what we see with Bitcoin is that such a majority, I think it's like 80-something% of outstanding Bitcoin have already been mined. There are certain people, especially in the Ethereum community, who posit that Bitcoin actually kind of like won't be able to sustain itself in perpetuity because its fees won't be high enough, the dilution won't be high enough. And so whether or not that's true for Bitcoin, I think remains to be seen. But in particular, I think we're starting to see that this is a major problem for kind of like other projects that have launched since then, and especially ones which are very human focused. So the kind of central theme I'm going to bring everything back to is this idea that communities exist across time. Communities are incredibly easy to launch, but are very, very difficult to sustain. It's very easy to start a new, Facebook club or Facebook group, excuse me, or Telegram room. It's a lot harder to keep people coming back. And communities are very sort of like people-based businesses, right? They're not like a technology company where you build something at the beginning and the product just runs itself, in perpetuity, like Craigslist, right? Communities are kind of the exact opposite of that. You have a bunch of people putting in a lot of energy on a continuous basis. And you need people to be carrying that torch over time, right? You need them to keep coming back and to have a real sort of incentive for doing that. And so one of the models that we look at around communities that I think is really meaningful is the orbit model of communities, right? This idea that the community at the center is kind of like the star, and you have different contributors who are in the orbit of that community, who are kind of entering and exiting based on their sort of ability to contribute. And this is what we imagine this looks like across time, right? Where you have different contributors who are sort of flowing in, ebbing and flowing, and all this is kind of constantly changing. But over time, people and contributors are kind of like proving themselves. And so when we look at like these fixed supply tokens, when they're used for communities, we see kind of like a number of problems start to jump out fairly quickly. The first one, and kind of the most obvious one, is just that like it's very difficult to fix mistakes. Oftentimes DAOs will have like a particular plan. They'll launch their token, they'll start giving it out, and they'll make some sort of mistake with their distribution. And it's basically impossible to fix it. And talking to people who've done this, oftentimes the best solution is just to fork the token, leave it behind, and launch a new one. And that's like fine, I guess, in the early days, but is in general just like not very scalable across time. And I think it kind of ignores the central sort of glaring factor, which is that people make mistakes. Communities operate with imperfect information, and their token model should reflect that and should be able to kind of adjust in the face of their lack of sureness over their decisions. The primary mistake that they make is that they typically give away too much ownership too quickly. Again, like I said, most people think about, when they think about giving away ownership, they think about startups or these other kind of like high capital-based businesses where you need a lot of investment up front, and these businesses scale over time. Communities don't scale. Communities are the opposite. They're sort of like meant to be very people-oriented, and if you give away too much ownership too early, you kind of screw people over later who don't have enough incentives to kind of like keep it going. And then finally, the sort of more nuanced one is just around the idea that, if I own like 1% of a token, and it's so important, as we recognize, for these communities to persist across time, then I can just keep owning my 1% and coasting while sort of the rest of the community does all the work. And this is, of course, also just like not very fair for the people who, it's sort of this like free rider problem. It's not very fair for the people who are doing all the work. So as we first started building Myco, which is a platform for digital communities, we kind of realized that this would be a huge problem. So we initially swung the pendulum the opposite direction and said, okay, well, what if we had no limit on dilution? Ethereum technically has no limit on dilution, although it has like a very specific way tokens get minted, so dilution is generally very restricted. But basically, we asked ourselves, was uncapped dilution any better? And what we found, especially talking to users, was that it wasn't that much better. Basically, you run into this huge problem, especially in the context of tokens which aren't meant to be kind of traded and sold and have these like very sort of high liquidity markets, is it becomes like really hard to price anything, right? You're pricing tasks without really knowing kind of the context within which you're pricing them. Everything kind of has to be rewarded relative to each other, right? Like I know the person who's leading this DAO should be getting, I don't know, 10%, so maybe we'll measure new contributors relative to that. But it's like just a very difficult way to measure contributions when there's like no market supply or there's no like denominator for a fraction. So we kind of realized this wasn't necessarily ideal, and really like what we realized, we needed a limit on dilution, right? Unlimited dilution is just not scalable across time, and also generally speaking is like very, very attackable, especially for social DAOs, which aren't like Ethereum, who can potentially push kind of protocol updates or updates to their dilution and basically just dilute away anyone who was there previously. So there needed to be kind of some assurances around the tokens that were being given out, so anyone who received tokens would kind of be able to at least predict, okay, here are these, 10,000 tokens, okay, this will be 0.1% this year and maybe 0.01 the next year and so on. So then we say, okay, well, we know we need a limit of some sort, but we don't know what it should be. We don't know how to determine it. And so to approach this problem, we kind of started from first principles. We start with our primary principle that communities exist across time. The second kind of important principle is this idea that communities have churn, that communities are constantly kind of growing and shrinking, that people are leaving on a regular basis. And then finally, we recognize that communities go through cycles, or attention cycles in particular, when lots of people are churning and growing simultaneously, that the individuals aren't just like autonomous actors. And so what we thought about was, okay, well, what if we think about this like community across time and we slice it into chunks, right? We slice it into these little pieces, and we imagine, let's say, a month is the right period to slice into. And we think about this asset as like of community time. And so you imagine that every month, 1 million shares or 1 million tokens or whatever of community time, shares of community time are created, and that those shares are created like in perpetuity. Basically, every month that a community exists, it mints another 1 million shares of community time, and that this happens, in perpetuity forever. And what we imagine, and this is sort of like provides a limit in the sense that at any given moment, that the total number of tokens is 1 million times the total number of months in which it's existed, which is a pretty great and relatively simple way to think about this. But it makes sense, again, thinking about communities across time. And what you end up with is basically that over time, contributors' ownership percentage is constantly in flux, right? As you're kind of entering the orbit and exiting, the amount of tokens you own won't change, but the percentage that ends up converting into will be very dynamic. And we imagine that this is actually like a virtue because it, again, sort of forces you to keep coming back, but also because it allows the community to be super responsive, basically, to its environment and to changing conditions, changing contributors, and all that stuff. And so, yeah, like I said, total ownership is kind of accruing to people or diluting away from people over time based on how they contribute, not at any given moment, but across time. So then we start to think about, okay, we know we have this like limit on dilution, let's say 1 million shares a month. Then we say, okay, well, maybe it could change, right? Maybe some months it's 1 million, some months it's 500,000, and some months it's 2 million, right? Is that maybe something that's meaningful or relevant? And again, going back to our earlier question of these like cycles of attention, right? We kind of know that maybe there's this variability over time, so maybe the token model should also kind of reflect that. And to answer this question, we'll start with the worst case scenario, because this is kind of the most important one, right? We imagine we're at that, if we go back, we imagine we're at that sort of like low point in attention. The community's productivity is waning. People aren't, contributing as much. The, attention is kind of going down. And, the community's whole point is to bring people back. They want to reverse this trend. And if we're thinking about like shares of community time being sort of like more of them being minted when more value is being created and less being minted when less value is being created, what we would end up with is that as soon as the community starts to shrink, the number of rewards available for contributors goes down, and this essentially kind of like leads us to this this like kind of death spiral path, right? Where fewer contributors leads to fewer rewards, leads to fewer people contributing, et cetera. So we kind of recognize, okay, well, in the down, like in the sort of worst case scenario, we don't want rewards to shrink in those down months, right? And so then we can imagine that like relative rewards actually probably want to increase during these moments. This is probably when we want to have the most rewards, relatively speaking, going to people, right? We want the rewards to ramp up when the community needs those rewards the most, or the contributions the most. But we also recognize the opposite is bad as well. Imagine the community is growing, everything is going really well, but all of a sudden the community starts minting less shares. That also doesn't make any sense. That's going to slow the community's growth down. And so if we know that we can't shrink the number of shares being diluted in the worst case, we also can't shrink in the best case. If it is ever growing, that essentially leads us back to the unlimited case. And so we have to decide to keep it flat over time. But what we can do is think about this idea of splitting pools, right? And this is like fairly straightforward. If you have 1 million shares being created every month, those shares are being split based on whoever's contributing in that month. And so you have this sort of natural modulation effect that occurs where, if your DAO has like, let's say 10 contributors 1 month, each of them is getting 10%, let's say, assuming it's being split evenly. If the number of contributors goes down, each contributor is getting, relatively speaking, more. And so the mechanism has a way of sort of naturally modulating attention and responding to that if you're able to track who's active in such a way that, people are able to earn more and the incentive to stick around actually goes higher the fewer people that are there. And this is kind of what we wanted when we mentioned regular or higher relative rewards in those kind of like down moments or those moments when attention is really dropping. And so ultimately, just to go into the sort of splitting pools, there's a lot of really interesting things we can do when we start to think about like 1 million shares being created every month and then those shares flowing to different pools. Because we can then start to program these pools independently and use them for these different purposes, right? So we can imagine that a role in a DAO might have a particular pool. Let's say all the treasurers or any treasurers who are active split 10% of the month's dilution. Or you could potentially have a pool for just like a community treasury, basically, so that any sort of discretionary rewards can be given out at any moment. Or you could have like pools for other random different types of distribution methods, right? You could have incentives for people who are referring other members to the DAO, or you could have incentives for people who are making posts, or for people who are performing tasks. Basically, these pools can be kind of like any functional domain within the DAO, any kind of like effort they want to encourage. That money can then flow to that pool. And so the DAO itself can over time kind of just adjust what it, the dilution pools based on what activities it thinks are most important in that moment. So for instance, next month maybe we want to focus more on growth and less on content creation. We might shrink the pool that's going towards making posts and grow the pool that's going towards referral rewards. And this has this sort of like natural way of responding to the environment and lets the community kind of constantly reevaluate like what is most important right now, what are we really focusing on, rather than being kind of like locked into this model that we see a lot of communities doing, where they set a token distribution plan and they basically just stick to it for a year and a half without really being able to change it. So ultimately, if we combine all of this, just to summarize, we have this very simple model, right? Communities dilute 1 million tokens a month, and those tokens go to whoever's contributing in that month. And we get all these like really wonderful properties that we didn't get with fixed supply tokens. So we have this like flexibility on a monthly basis. You can recalculate. It incentivizes community sustenance. It sort of recognizes that communities are people businesses and need kind of constant rewards over time. It dilutes dormant contributors, so if people are kind of slacking or you have this free rider problem, it gets rid of that. It has this predictable dilution schedule, so even though there is dilution to sustain it, it isn't unlimited, and there's a very sort of simple way for people to predict what it will be over time. We have this idea of the periodic recalculation. This is, again, something really important for the kind of imperfect information DAOs have, especially early on. And then finally, we have this, because of the pools and the sort of splitting that occurs with people who are active, you have this relative incentives, sort of responding to fluctuations in attention. So this is what we're building over at Myco. Myco is a platform for social DAOs. And we're really excited to be onboarding people to our beta right now who want to kind of test out this new model. We're kind of in the weeds on building up new ways for digital communities and DAOs to operate themselves and sustain themselves. And so we're kind of always looking for new partners. If any of this was particularly interesting, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm at Mark Beylin on most platforms. And I love to talk about this stuff. Happy to answer questions. And if you're interested in using Myco, feel free to just shoot me a DM and we can get you on soon. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'd love to answer.